Good afternoon, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's virtual book talk series. Today's program features Amy Gore and her new book, Book Anatomy, Body Politics, and the Materiality of Indigenous Book History, which was published last year by the University of Massachusetts Press. The virtual book talk series highlights recent work broadly related to book history, print culture, and material texts, and it is sponsored by the Program in the History of the Book in American Culture. My name is John Garcia, the Society's Director of Scholarly Programs and Partnerships. The American Antiquarian Society is a research library and alerted society founded in 1812 by the printer Isaiah Thomas. Our goal is to foster a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in our ever-growing collection of primary sources, which currently numbers approximately 4.5 million individual items produced in what is now the United States, Canada, and the Caribbean from the earliest period of European colonization up through the 19th century. The Society fosters an inclusive community of inquiry through our public programs and through generous support for scholarship. We welcome researchers from around the country and around the world to use our collections, both physical and digital, to help them with their projects. And to learn more about us, please visit our website, americanantiquarian.org. Today, I'm joined behind the scenes by my colleague, Lauren Havelas. Throughout the program, Lauren will post useful information in the chat, including instructions on how you can purchase Amy Gore's book with the discount code from the publisher. Towards the end of the program, after Amy Gore's presentation, we will have conversation with the author, and for that, I would like you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We thank you for joining us today, and as a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support you can give to help us with our endeavors. And I would also like to note that today's program is being recorded, and it will be available on the AAS YouTube channel in the near future. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Amy Gore is Assistant Professor of English at North Dakota State University, where she teaches and researches early and 19th century American literature, book history and print culture, and Native American literatures. Her first book, which we'll learn more about today, Book Anatomy, Body Politics and the Materiality of Indigenous Book History, theorizes the material relationships between books and bodies to argue that the book itself is an embodied form power relations. And she's working currently on a second book, which is co-edited with Dan Radis, which is an edited collection of essays entitled Gatherings, New Directions in Indigenous Book History. And this will hopefully appear print in the very near future. Professor Gore is also a senior fellow in the Andrew W. Mellon Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography at the Rare Book School. And her research has been supported by organizations such as the NEH and most recently a Reese Fellowship at the American Antiquarian Society. She has many essays that are coming out in edited collections, and her articles have also been published in places such as Pedagogy, Studies in American Indian Literature, and Western American literature. And now I'd like to turn the program over to our speaker.
Thanks, John. I'm just going to share my screen quickly here. So thanks very much to John for the introduction and for the speaking today. I'm very pleased to be back with the American Antiquarian Society, virtually at least, after, as John mentioned, I had the privilege of spending part of my past summer here on a Reese Fellowship, doing research at AAS for another project. It was an incredible experience. Not only did the AAS collections surpass my imagination, but the staff were incredibly warm, helpful, and collegial. And often experts themselves in the items that I called up. So thanks to all of you for having me today. I also wanted to give a quick shout out to Trinity College. My colleague and friend Eric Stokovich told me that he organized a watch party for this event, which was very flattering. So a shout out to all of you zooming in from Trinity and elsewhere. Thank you very much to my audience for joining me today. I want to begin with two things. First, to give credit to the artwork I'm showcasing on my opening slide here, which comes from Nicholas Galanin, who is a Tlingit and Onagax artist. Both images are from his installation, What We Have Become. I was lucky enough to feature another one of his images from the same installation on the cover of my book, which you'll see on the next slide. Secondly, I want to begin by situating myself in this work. I'm a fifth-generation Italian-American immigrant and an outsider to Indigenous communities. As such, I think a lot about the responsibility of stories. I have responsibilities as a storyteller to tell Indigenous stories respectfully and in the ways that I have been taught by my Native teachers and by Native scholars. I also think about the responsibility of the listener to stories, and today that's all of you. Toni Morrison teaches us about this responsibility in the way she breaks down the word responsibility. We all have the ability to respond to stories, to make a response as listeners, to take action. Leslie Marmon Silko from Laguna Pueblo puts it another way. Quote, "I will tell you something about stories," she says. "They aren't just entertainment. Don't be fooled. They are all we have, you see, all we have to fight off illness and death. You don't have anything if you don't have the stories." And responding to Silko, Thomas King concludes one of his essays, The Truth About Stories, with, quote, "But help yourself to a story if you like. It's yours. Do with it what you will. Cry over it, get angry, forget it, but don't say in the years to come that you would have lived your life differently. If only you had heard this story. You've heard it now," end quote. And that quote has really become a touchstone as I move through my career in Native literature. It's been a really powerful kind of, I guess, talisman for me as I kind of think about my responsibility to Native stories. When we agree to listen to Native stories, we also agree to respond, to be active listeners, to be responsible to these stories. So I invite you today to not only listen to these Indigenous stories, starting with our land acknowledgement that John provided, but also to consider what ongoing actions you might take in sharing stories of Indigenous books and of Indigenous literary accomplishments with others. So I've told you a bit about how I position myself in relation to this work and the ways in which we all have a responsibility to Native stories. I'm going to turn now to talk about my book, Book Anatomy, Body Politics, and the Materiality of Indigenous Book History. This project began when I kept tripping over the phrase book anatomy. Bibliographers seem to use it very casually in labeling the different material pieces of a book. And you can see an example of this on my slide here, the graphic on the right. But it caught my attention, and I grew curious about the many ways in which we use body language to describe books. We refer to a book's spine and appendix, a book's face, its header and footer, its body paragraphs, and even an author's body of work or corpus. In fiction, we think about words creating imaginary bodies, characters, or about words imaginatively acting upon bodies of the past, present, and future. And we know this, like if we read a book that's particularly moving and we cry, right? Those words act upon our bodies physically. But here was something much more literal. We hold such an affinity to books that we name their parts as we name ourselves. So in my book, I use this curious relationship between books and bodies to think about the ways in which Indigenous authors negotiated representations of their bodies, and more specifically, their racialized bodies in the American publishing industry. I found that the language of book anatomy reflects a long cultural investment in the link between books and bodies. The bibliographical terms of spine, appendix, header, and footnote permeate the book with human endowments, but they also reflect the significant social and material reality of books as made out of actual bodies, bodies of plants, animals, and sometimes even other humans, as several recent books provocatively evaluate. Sarah Key's Animal Skins and the Reading Self, published in 2017, Joshua Calhoun's The Nature of the Page, published in 2020, and Megan Rosenblum's grim but very provocative and insightful book called Dark Archives, a librarian's investigation into the science and history of books bound in human skin, published in 2020. Many have considered the book to extend the life of the human body beyond the grave, and we may even expect books to do what bodies cannot, namely to transcend the invisible forces of time and distance and death. So in other words, perhaps we expect the materiality of the body of the book to vicariously give us an immortal body. Simultaneously, what Andrew Piper identifies as the tremendous cultural investment in the corporeal identity of the book falls back on a precarious ability to read the human body, which often rested on false assumptions of race and physical ability. The book, in other words, materially carries our humanity as well as our human stories. From the annotations, signature, and stains from the human hands of its readers to the socially and culturally embedded means of its material production. Books contain more than corporeal representations and symbolism. Whether fiction or nonfiction, books facilitate bodily encounters. As Michelle Kupal, Aubrey Jean Hansen, Sarah Henze, and many Native literary scholars continue to attest, quote, stories are inseparable from the sovereignties, bodies, and traditional territories from which they arise, end quote. And as such, books act in relationship with and bear witness to the material worlds in which they circulate. So my project looked to the book itself and its paratextual elements, meaning its graphic design, its illustrations, typefaces, prefaces, appendices, copyright, frontispieces, everything that we normally tend to look over and don't consider to be part of reading a book necessarily, but that still contextualize and frame the narrative itself as an embodied expression of print culture power relations. Paratexts rise as the neglected spaces of Indigenous literature. As mediators of their texts, paratexts speak to the complex nature of the literary marketplace for Indigenous books. A book's textual content might undergo revisions, but paratexts often undergo the most drastic changes over time and between editions, revealing what the Multigraph Collective describes as the layered sites that bear the traces of ongoing change and of the various interactions they have experienced and enabled, like humans, perhaps. And there it is, another quote referring to books as humans or making a comparison. The paratext documents, for example, whether or not an Indigenous writer retained legal copyright, as I will just discuss here shortly from my first chapter with Cherokee author John Rollin Ridge's The Life and Adventures of Joaquin Murrieta, first published in 1854. An introduction or preface speaks to a text's reception among readers and the dynamics of the literary marketplace, and changing cover images can reveal the ongoing tensions in marketing Indigenous literary products and representations of Native peoples. And we still see that tendency somewhat even today, with feathers and horses often being put on the cover of contemporary Indigenous books. So rather than mere wrapping, paratexts not only frame the text, but signify its meaning. So because I'm interested in the ways the paratext changes across time and what it has to teach us about the changing interactions and negotiations of all kinds that happen in a book's marginal spaces, my book takes up 5 Indigenous books and looks not only at the first or most significant edition, but traces every known reprint and edition from each book's first publication to its most recent. For instance, every known edition of Ridge's Murieta from 1854 to the 2018 Penguin edition. Then for each book, Book Anatomy focuses thematically by chapter on one paratextual element, highlighting one's particular significance in relation to the book's embodiment over time. For example, copyright with Ridge's Murieta, blank space with the first books published by Native women writers Winnemucca and Callahan, Pretty Shield's thumbprint signature, and footnotes and citations with McNickle's The Surrounded. While Daniel Heath Justice offers in Why Indigenous Literatures Matter, published in 2018, that Indigenous writings matter for the ways in which they teach readers about past, current, and future relationships, I add that the materiality of Indigenous literatures also matters, not only in the transmission of the stories they contain, but also as a documentation for the material conditions of Indigenous relationships, corporeal existence, and structures of power. So I'm going to ground this theory about the paratext by sharing with you one brief opening example from my book. In the 1930s, a white ethnographer named Frank Linderman became determined to tell what he called, quote, a woman's story, meaning to record a Native woman's perspective of life on the Great Plains before colonization. He built a professional relationship with a Crow, also known as Absaloka woman, named Pretty Shield, who agreed to tell him her life story. They communicated frequently using Plains Indian Sign Language, while another woman, Goes Together, simultaneously translated Pretty Shield's spoken Crow language into English for Linderman's added benefit. While the ways in which the text became embodied physically through this sign language is fascinating, even more fascinating is that once the book was published in 1932, one of the opening paratextual pages of the book, and you'll see that here in the middle, stresses Pretty Shield's agency over her own story and her own body with an inked impression of her thumb and the assertive caption, quote, "I told Sign Talker," which is, she's referring to Linderman there, "the things that are in this book and have signed the paper with my thumb," end quote. Pretty Shield's thumbprint marks the text that follows as her own, imprinting her body on the very pages of what could otherwise have been an ethnographic exploitation under other circumstances, and putting the book under her thumb, so to speak. Every subsequent reprint and edition of this book, up to the most recent HarperCollins 2021 edition, retains Pretty Shield's thumbprint in the opening paratextual pages of her book. So in looking to the paratext, I examine the mutual negotiations, transactions, and perceptions that took place not only in the moment of print, but also in a book's continuing reverberations across time. Books are made and remade with every generation, and as valuable as those first editions are, we seriously undermine the value of books when we prize only the first or authoritative edition. Instead, my project seeks to show the value of books across time, in a continuation of story only begun with a first edition. So in addition to Pretty Shield, I talk about 4 other Indigenous books and authors from the late 19th to the early 20th century, which is an era that has arguably received less attention in Native literary scholarship than other eras. However, since I have the opportunity to speak to an American Antiquarian Society audience today, I thought I would share some of my first chapter, which traces the story of what is probably the most valuable and the most plagiarized book in Indigenous literary history, John Rollin Ridge's The Life and Adventures of Joaquin Murrieta. First published in 1854 and known today as the first novel published by a Native American and the first novel published in the newly incorporated state of California. And when I say valuable, it's valuable not only for these firsts, but to my knowledge, only 1 copy of the first edition remains extant in the world, held at the Beinecke, Yale University. Although I have heard that there may potentially be 1 more in private collection. So if that's you, please reach out. I would love to talk. I'll start by giving you some background on the author, move to the plot of the book, and then talk a little bit about the changes that happened to Ridge's book in the first few editions. Cherokee writer and expatriate John Rollin Ridge came to California in the heyday of the gold rush. After a brief and unsuccessful stint as a lawyer and on the run from a murder he allegedly committed in Kansas, Ridge followed the streams of migrants headed to the farmlands and gold mining camps of the coastal state. There he attempted to prosper not with a sluice pan or a shovel, but with a pen, publishing poems and articles in local periodicals while picking up work as a newspaper editor. As a man with literary ambitions, Ridge soon turned to the novel and decided to capitalize on the romanticized exploits of the outlaw Joaquin Murrieta that had been circulating in regional newspapers. He struck literary gold with his first and only novel, The Life and Adventures of Joaquin Murrieta, the celebrated California Bandit. And you'll see that first edition is on your right here, the yellow. The slim, pamphlet-sized book anticipates later dime novels and claims to recount with historical accuracy the events of Murrieta's life, from the bandit's push into a life of crime to his beheading. Ridge's novel inserts readers in the intense violence of mid-century California. As the novel opens, the narrative paints a sympathetic portrayal of Murrieta, who enthusiastically crosses the border from his boyhood home in Sonora at the conclusion of the US-Mexico War in hopes of becoming an American citizen. He immediately encounters racial prejudice, however, and after a series of brutalities in which Americans rape his mistress, lynch his half-brother, run him off his farm, and whip him, Murrieta turns against what the book calls his generous and noble nature and into a life of crime. Because of the similar injustices experienced by other Mexicans in California, a number of men began to join Murrieta's band and initiate what in effect becomes an organized crime unit with the sadistic three-fingered Jack as Murrieta's right-hand man. The bulk of the novel then relays their daring adventures and close encounters with vigilante law as they exact revenge on the America that denied their equality. The novel ends with Murrieta and Jack's dismemberment at the hands of Captain Love and translates the tragedy of Murrieta's life into a moral lesson. And this is a quote from one of the last pages of the book. Quote, "There is nothing so dangerous in its consequences as injustice to individuals, whether it arise from prejudice of color or from any other source, that a wrong done to one man is a wrong done to society and to the world," end quote. Morietta leaves the reader entertained by the bandits' daring exploits, but it rewraps the gratuitous sensationalism in the sober message of tragic injustice. As so many others living in 1850s California experienced, however, Ridge did not find the wealth and success of his dreams. Instead, he had his book, his profits, and his copyright stolen from him. In a letter to his relative Stan Wattie, Ridge complains of having been swindled from his profits when his publishers sold 7,000 copies of his book, but then declared bankruptcy and, quote, left me along with 100 others to whistle for our money, end quote. 5 years later, Ridge discovers the theft not only of his profits, but also his copyright when a salacious crime magazine, the California Police Gazette, ran his story as a serial in their periodical for 10 consecutive issues from September 3rd to November 5th, 1859, and then published it again in a book form that same year, all without his consent or byline. And I have a comparison for you to read here of the first sentence of each book. The similarities between the two texts, I think, pretty clearly demonstrate the plagiarism of Ridge's edition. And if any of you have had the misfortune of reading a student plagiarism, you'll see that there seems to be a pretty clear word substitution with really the same kind of grammatical structure. Although some of the Gazette's changes do polish Ridge's prose and add further details to Morietta's life, they nevertheless work to disguise the theft of Ridge's literary labor. They also undermine the original narrative's call for racial justice, most notably in the changes made to the ending. As Joe Goki documents, the Gazette radically alters Ridge's ending lament of injustice for people of color by cutting out two of the original text's most often quoted passages. The one I just quoted regarding injustice to individuals, and the final line, quote, alas, how happy might Rosita not have been had man never learned to wrong his fellow man, end quote. Instead, in the plagiarism, the last sentence reads, quote, but little doubt exists in the writer's mind that many persons who are mentioned in the advertisements headed information wanted and emanating perhaps from a mother inquiring for her son or a wife for her husband have been the victims of the bandit Joaquin, end quote. With this, the Gazette ends with the sad injustice experienced not by people of color, but by Americans, and I would add perhaps more implicitly the tears of white women as the victims of Murieta. Not only do the textual changes therefore sever Ridge from his text, but they also sever what Irwin identifies as Ridge's attempt to put, quote, American racism at the root of the violence. In addition to erasing Ridge's byline and copyright from the opening pages, the Gazette cuts out the first edition's two prefaces that address Ridge's identity. They identify him, so that they cut that out, and intentions for the text, while also replacing the original Anthony and Baker lithographs with several illustrations by Charles Christian Knoll, who was a well-established artist whose work embellished many San Francisco periodicals during the 1850s. The Knoll illustrations would later predominate nearly all major reprints of Ridge's Morietta, appearing in both plagiarisms and byline editions from the 19th century up into the most recent 21st century Penguin reprint. Even as these modern editions restore Ridge's byline to his literary work, the Knoll illustrations, as a symbol of the Gazette plagiarism here, continue to haunt the book to the present day. And here's a slide, a sampling of some of those covers. and how the null illustrations from the plagiarism keep cropping up like a bad penny. Even though they are powerful illustrations, they keep reminding, kind of carrying forward the history of the plagiarism of Ridge's book. No known records exist of any attempt by Ridge to pursue legal action against the Gazette, but neither did he give up claims to his book. Although his unexpected death in October 1867 cut short any legal action he might have taken, the second edition of his book includes an enraged author's preface that calls out the unjust plagiarism of his book and claims this 1871 edition as, quote, a matter of justice, both to the author and the public, inasmuch as a spurious edition has been foisted upon unsuspecting publishers and by them circulated to the infringement of the author's copyright and the damage of his literary credit, end quote. Here's that author's preface if you'd like to see, and there's that third edition, so 1871, 1874. Sadly, however, Ridge's attempt at justice were largely ignored in the course of history. He never received restitution for the copyright theft, and instead, the Gazette plagiarism became the most popular source of the Murrieta story. In fact, Murrieta has become one of the most internationally appropriated single narratives in literary history, I would argue, translated into multiple languages and genres, which today include novels, films, plays, song, an epic poem, children's books, which is weird to me because there's a beheading that features centrally in the plot. A Soviet rock opera has actually appropriated this story. And this book is the inspiration for both Batman and Zorro. The number of versions and editions throughout the 20th century remain uncounted, but certainly range in the hundreds, all printed without profit to Ridge or his descendants. And while Ridge's original narrative has now lived in public domain for well over 100 years, its original theft remains problematic for contemporary editions, translations, and adaptations that perpetuate the plagiarism without acknowledging its problematic history or sometimes even crediting Ridge. So what I'm doing in this chapter is tracing not only the roller coaster of a book history for the first Native novel, but I also parallel Ridge's loss of legal copyright with the loss of property rights for Indigenous peoples during the 19th century and beyond, as well as Mexican-American citizens in California in the aftermath of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Multiple scholars cite that the model for copyright is real property, so I think this is no coincidence. And in this context, the foul play towards Ridge's copyright stands as especially egregious. In Isabel Hoffmeyer's words, one route into being a rights-bearing subject was to become a book-bearing one. And for Ridge to write and attempt to publish a book under his own copyright made a provocative statement in the midst of the overwhelming dispossession of his era and in the continued disenfranchisement of Native peoples as citizens, subjects, and fully realized human beings. Yet Ridge's property rights were ignored while others profited off of his written version of the Murrieta story. Secondly, what I'm doing in this chapter is talking about what I call editorial dismemberments. To explain, I'll first talk about the legend of Joaquin Murrieta as the person, the figure, which ends with a beheading and a dismemberment, and then apply it to book history. In August of 1853, a poster appeared in Stockton, California, to advertise the town's newest local entertainment. For one day only, as the poster announces, one can be gruesomely titillated by the dismembered body parts of two infamous California bandits. Joaquin Murrieta's head and Three-Fingered Jack's hand preserved in large jars, had not been easily obtained and pointed to the continuing violence within the newly formed state of California. In previous years, following the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, newspapers began to announce the continual raids and murders committed against local citizenry and blamed a man named Joaquin as the ringleader. Yet the newspapers could not agree. At times, Joaquin had as many as 5 different last names, perhaps representing 5 different men, and he seemed able to commit crimes simultaneously in widely spread geographical locations. The crimes for which Murrieta was accused became so troublesome that on May 11th, 1853, the California legislature authorized Captain Harry Love and his group of rangers to capture the elusive Murrieta. And there's legal documents from California legislature authorizing this search, manhunt, if you will. After 2 months of searching, Love and his men triumphantly brought a dismembered head and hand that they claimed belonged to the one and only Joaquin Murrieta and his lieutenant, Three-Fingered Jack, to the governor in exchange for a substantial monetary reward. The controversially identified body parts then made their way around the state in an attempt to convince California citizens of the reestablishment of law and order. At the conclusion of Ridge's novel, the narrative follows Murrieta's head past its decapitation to its exhibition across the state of California. It reports the surprise of superstitious onlookers who were seized with a kind of terror to observe that the mustache of the fearful robber had grown longer since his head was cut off, and that the nails of Three-Fingered Jack's hand had lengthened almost an inch. Three-Fingered Jack's hand also invoked in the morbid sightseers a strange, haunting dread over the mind, as if it had been a conscious, voluntary agent of evil. In his reading, David Drysdale invokes the novel itself as another type of decapitated exhibit, one through which Americans can similarly read the history of California conquest and perhaps through the materiality of the book itself, participate in the circulation of the outlaw's head. His words match Meredith McGill's description of reprinting books as a process by which, quote, authors are detached and reattached to their texts, end quote. Their words provoke a sobering reflection on the production of editions, not only as the rebirth of the book's body, but also potentially a disfigurement or even decapitation of a previous bookish corpus. Although critics may consider piracy and plagiarism as types of dismemberment, they largely have not considered this omission that I'm talking about of omission and replacement of paratextual elements between editions as a series of editorial dismemberments. Yet such paratextual changes often radically repackage a text. They offer new additional parts that refigure or sometimes disfigure the bibliographic body. They may silently remove cover images and aesthetic design or illustrations that could otherwise reveal a certain historical moment to critics and readers. They may also obscure the text's history of reception and perception by omitting and replacing such items as the introduction, which contributes vital information to the history of the book. And to return to the central argument of my book, we can only know the full story of a book when we move beyond primarily valuing the first edition only and reach across the reprints of time. So I'll conclude with this. In the unfinished book, Alexandra Gillespie writes, quote, books like decapitated heads are uncanny objects. They signify in the absence of their author's capacity to speak, end quote. The book history of Ridge's Morieta troubles our assumption of new editions, even scholarly editions, as primarily in service of the text and its author. Like the continued growth of hair on Morieta's severed head, the unsettling bibliographic body lives on after its dismemberment, as both a continuing presence that destabilizes the state's narrative of closure and as a haunting testament to the racialized inheritance of book history. The bibliographical bodies of Indigenous book history continue to gesture towards the expansive dispossession that extends from property rights to copyright for Indigenous people, while simultaneously refusing to accept their bibliographical severance by growing, reanimating, and unsettling. Every reading of the text, every reprint and new edition participates in the reattachment and decapitation of Murieta's head, exhibiting the ongoing tension between membership and dismemberment in this country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy. That was great. There's so much going on, so much rich material just in this chapter, but I think it's just a taste that we get of the entire book. One of the major takeaways that I have from it is that it feels feels not the right word. It to me it seems like one of the most effective analyses that uses the term paratext, right? And you're thinking about paratext as something that is material, right? It's something that we see in printing. It's ideological, right? And it's also a place for agency from authors. We have time for many questions. I see that a couple have come in, but encourage everybody in the audience to think about putting a question into the Q&A, and remember the Q&A, not the chat. Just to start things off, as our audience is processing some of your insights, I wanted to ask a question of you about place, really. When I was reading book anatomy, one of the things that stood out to me was that so much of the emphasis is on authors and stories that are centered on what we would now consider the Western United States. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how how the work that you've done, say in Indigenous studies, in bibliography or book history, forces us to think about this region, such as California or other places, and takes us outside of the kind of traditional emphasis so much on the Northeastern publishing industry. And so Walking Murieta, and another chapter that didn't come in, unfortunately, is about Winnemucca, right, and life among the Paiutes. So yeah, the question there is why the West, and is there more to it that you'd like to explain to us?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Place is so important to my book, and of course to Indigenous literary studies, Indigenous peoples. And so I wanted to make sure that that was an emphasis and was a really natural emphasis for this book when I thought about the paratext as relationships. In bringing thoughts about place to book history, I found that citations were very important. So how we materially think about a book as being from place. So I thought about the publishing industry for sure in thinking about these chapters and in making my selections. And the breakdown is a little interesting. So my first chapter on Morieta, published in California, the 19th century historian Bancroft really interestingly described San Francisco as sort of publishing chaos, very much like some of the other gold mining camps. There were kind of pop-up publishing places that, as Ridge experienced, sort of went under in dubious ways. But then others the authors are from the West, but had their books published on the East Coast. So McNickle, even though he's from Montana, his first book was published in New York with Dodd Mead. Winnemucca, who's from the Southwest, had her book published in New York and Boston. And so there is this interesting relationship between author place and these centers of the publishing industry. And what I hope I emphasized and what I hope came through in my book is that the paratext allows us to think about those relationships. Why is there so much power centered in publishing industries in the Northeast, in the New England area? And I think that prompts us to think about that consolidation of power that's even more so happening today with the consolidation of the big five trade presses, and the fight for independent publishers, independent booksellers, to exist in these times, in these corporate times. Yeah, so place was very important here.
That's great. Thank you. So the questions are definitely rolling in now, and we can address them in the order that they've appeared. So early on in the program, a question came in from Michael Winship, who's known to many of us here as a friend of AAS. And Michael asked the question about Pretty Shield. He says the thumbprint that signs the first edition.
Mhm.
Was this a single thumbprint reproduced by letterpress throughout the edition? So I guess he's asking the question about how was the thumbprint reproduced?
I'm not quite sure. There are some that I would call facsimile reprints that, really simply scan the page and reproduce the entire text in that way. But I'm not sure. I did not kind of look into that production specifically. But the thumbprint does remain the same kind of whorls through all of the editions and reprints. So I'm not sure if that's kind of a block that was created or quite the technology behind that. To my knowledge, that technology is not kind of sitting in an archive somewhere, although I was finishing the book towards the end of the pandemic here, and I wanted to go to Missoula, where some of Frank Linderman's papers are, and maybe that production would be there. That'd be interesting. Thank you for that question.
Jesse Elaman, another frequent traveler at AAS, most recently as the Distinguished Scholar in Residence. Jesse has a question here about orality. He asked, how does the orality surrounding the Marietta lore before and after the publication of Ridge's novel relate to, if at all, or shape the textualized embodiment that the story takes in print with and after Ridge's published version? He says he's curious about your thoughts about this in other words. So it's a bit of a question, a bit of a mouthful there. How orality and lore invoke a different kind of body or embodiment for Ridge's life and adventures in Marietta.
Yeah, thank you. I've really come to think about all the text in this book as multimodal. And not only in thinking about these books and the way that they're embodied, the way that they relate to human bodies, but in the way that oral stories are also very, very physically present, if we can say that, in the book. So not only in the way that Pretty Shield orally tells her story to Linderman, and the way that she uses sign language as well as spoken language. But then, of course, with Ridge, the legend of Joaquin started orally in communities and then was picked up by newspapers and circulated through periodicals and then was picked up by Ridge's book. And so I think that there's less of a hard line for me at the end of this project between different types of communication than I think we're normally used to thinking about.
We have a question here. It's actually kind of interesting. I think this is concocted by several fellows who are in residence here. It is posted by Michelle Lemaster, but could be ventriloquizing Andrew Wildermuth. I suspect they're both probably in the fellows housing. The question here is, thank you for your talk. They say you mentioned that you read the conclusion of the Murrieta novel as thinking generally in support of systems working against persons of color. How do you situate this more broadly in Ridge's Over? However, in other words, in his journalist work, which he has supported, where he supported slavery and the Confederacy, they find him generally very polemical in his writing about various types of people, whether that be Indians west of the Mississippi, in quotations, or people of African descent. Do you have anything like a theory of how race works in Ridge's Over?
Ooh, that's a great question and a very complex answer, I would say. So Ridge is a complicated person. His father was part of the Ridge faction that the Cherokee Nation decided to assassinate after Ridge's father signed the Treaty of New Echota, which initiated the Trail of Tears. So very much a complicated figure in Cherokee history, Cherokee literary history. And then with the life and adventures of Joaquin Murrieta itself is a very complex racially. It is not a very clear polemic in support of racial justice, even though there are lines like I quoted that seem to be in favor of that. Ridge's novel did not portray Chinese immigrants in a favorable light at all. He also did not portray California natives in a favorable light at all. And in Ridge's writings, he seemed to have very much believed in a racial hierarchy among tribes, that some tribes were, to use the term of the day, more civilized than others. And he certainly seemed to think that the Cherokee were more civilized than California natives. And so I would say that Ridge the man, Ridge the collected works, and Ridge's Murrieta are very complex in politically and in terms of their position on racial justice.
Plenty more questions remain. We have one here from Patricia Crane, who did once teach a seminar for the program in the history book in American culture at AAS. Professor Crane asked, she says she'd love to know how the decision to sign, in quotation marks, Pretty Shield's book with a thumbprint, how was that decision made? Whose idea was it? And she's struck by the unusual forensic significance of fingerprints.
Yes, I do talk about the significance of fingerprints in forensic history in my chapter. That was fascinating, new territory for me to find out more about, and especially fingerprinting in racial history was very pertinent here. I have not come across any documentation of how that decision was made for Pretty Shield to place her thumbprint on the book, but Linderman also wrote down the life story of a man named Plentycoo, also from the Crow Nation, and Plentycoo's fingerprint is in the text as well. And I talk about this a little bit in my book, but for Plentycoo's book, his fingerprint floats. So his fingerprint initially starts out in the opening pages, and then by later editions, it's placed in the back. And so becomes a very much less dominant feature of the book, where in contrast, Pretty Shield, hers stays in the first, I would say, 2 pages, very much the opening pages, consistently. And so the ways in which we might think about a man versus a woman's as told to narrative, and the ways in which kind of authority and fingerprinting kind of mixes in with that in a very material, physical way for these books, for me was really fascinating to think about.
We have a question here from another recent fellow, Wynne Kelly. Wynne Kelly, Wynne writes the question. She asks a question that she qualifies it towards the end. So I'm going to repeat what she says at the end first because I think it's helpful. She's really interested in what made Murrieta's story sensational, specifically about this beheading that happens in the novel and also, in real life to somebody, right? And her question is, what's the historical basis? Essentially, I think was this common? Was this common in the U.S.? Um, uh, and how does that relate to Ridge's decision to include this in the story, in the sensational appeal of it?
Yeah, if I understand your question correctly, you're asking about sensationalism as a genre. And so certainly that helps to sell books. I mean, Ridge's Murrieta is a thin pamphlet, but it's packed with this nonstop, quite frankly, bloodshed. Reads as sort of an action adventure novel. And in the 1850s, this is the very beginning of dime novels, which really have a massive influence on the later 19th century in these sort of action-packed, plot-light stories that become, in a way, even ephemeral. And maybe that has something to do with the one extant copy of Ridge's book. So then sensationalism, I think, was certainly made to sell. I think we can see Ridge's journalistic impulse here and making it kind of short and punchy, helping it to sell well. And then certainly that was picked up with later dime novels. I hope that answers your question.
Of course, we can always we can have you follow up with Wynne later. We have actually, I think, an excellent question to take us toward the end of the program. This comes from David Perez, and he's wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the other examples of Indigenous book history and publishing that you discuss in Book Anatomy.
Sure. So in McNickle's The Surrounded, it's an interesting book published in 1936. And that book I take up to speak of place, the place in which it was published, first in New York and then picked up by the University of New Mexico later in the 70s. And the relationship between the Southwest and ways of seeing and being seen with the Indian tourism that was happening in the 20th century to these native spaces. And then I pick up on that ways of seeing and being seen with tourism and take that into thinking about citations and the politics of citations. And so how we place ourselves, how we see ourselves in relation with others through our works cited pages, through our footnotes. And interesting, even though Surrounded is a novel, there are several instances of McNickle inserting a footnote in his novel, and then citing ethnographers in this really interesting epigraph at the beginning of his book. So that's just a brief teaser, I guess, trailer of my last chapter. The other chapter that I haven't mentioned yet was, I think, one of the most difficult for me to write, but the one that I also feel most proud of. I talked about the first books published by Native women in America. It's Alice Callahan's Wainema, published in 1891, and also Sarah Winnemucca's Life Among the Paiutes. And those two books, I think about blank space and the ways in which the paratext, the books have marginal spaces that are blank. You know, aesthetically, we need that blank space in order to read, even the blank space between letters, between words. And so I take up thinking about blank space and the ways in which it works on the page, and then extend that to thinking about the way blank space has worked for Native peoples, colonial maps in which Indigenous lands were represented as blank spaces, implicitly blank spaces to be colonized, to be explored, to be known. And then the ways in which these authors use blank space as places of agency. So, for example, in Life Among the Paiutes, Winnemucca includes a petition for the return of Paiute land at the end of her book. And she uses blank space, inserts blank space in the end of her book there at the end of that petition, and encourages people to sign. So to physically sign their name into the blank spaces of her book for Indigenous activism. So thanks for allowing me to get those, a little bit of those 2 chapters in.
That's great. And thank you, Amy. Unfortunately, the hour is up, and so we do have to conclude for today. We do have many exciting programs coming up in the fall. And I encourage you to learn more is to go to the AS website and look at the programs and events page. You can learn about everything that's coming up for the rest of the year. And that's also a place where you can register both for our in-person events and those that are streamed entirely online. Speaking of entirely online, our next program is going to be on next Tuesday, October 1st, where we'll have a virtual online program with author Whitney Robles, who will share her new book, Curious Species, How Animals Made Natural History. That one is going to be streamed online via Zoom. Our next hybrid program will be Transhistory and Historicism in the Digital Age, which is a conversation between KG Rowson and Jen Mannion. And this will take place both at Antiquarian Hall and also via Zoom. AAS will also welcome historian Jack Rakoff, who will give the 2024 Robert C. Barron Lecture on October 17th. And during this lecture, Professor Rakoff will offer reflections on a very influential book, Original Meanings, Politics and Ideas in the Making of the Constitution. And so I encourage you, of course, to register for all these programs, to keep an eye out for more to come. And last but not least, I also want to mention our next installment of the Virtual Book Talk series will feature Sarah Johnson and her exciting new book, Encyclopedia Noire, The Making of Moreau de Sainte-Marie's Intellectual World, which came out through the University of North Carolina Press and the Omohundro Institute. And this program will take place on Thursday, November 21st at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Thanks once again to Professor Amy Gore for a fabulous presentation. And for now, so long, take care, and we'll see you soon.